Hello.
The Munchkin Diary, My Personal Yellow Brick Road, was written by Betty Ann Bruno, who is with us today to talk a bit about it. The Munchkin Diary gives you a clue where her connection with Oz comes in to be a part of today's program. Betty Ann, why don't you tell us, for starters, because Oz fans will be curious to know how you came to be a Munchkin in the MGM film?
Oh, that's a wonderful childhood story. When I was a very young girl, we lived in Hollywood. And as a lot of girls in Hollywood in those days, this was in the 30s, I took singing and dancing lessons. Major dance studios all had bulletin boards that had auditions, posted the auditions at the major studios for parts for children. And it was Hollywood. That's what it was all about. And most people I knew were either entertainers or in clubs or on stage in theaters or in movies. My Uncle Ace, who lived right next door to us, had bit parts in movies, had and owned a nightclub where he had 3 floor shows every night. And so I was surrounded in my childhood by people who were actors and singers and dancers and so on. So to me, it was perfectly normal. My mother saw the audition notice at the dance studio and took me to the audition, and I made the cut. The requirement was you had to be a little girl, not over 4.5 feet tall, who could sing and dance and act terrified. So I made that cut, and we practiced as 12 little girls. That was, and we thought that's all the children who would be in the movie. And we were 2 weeks singing and dancing in a practice studio by ourselves, and then we were taken to the sound stage and saw the other Munchkins. And when I walked into that stage, that was another world. I mean, it was so gorgeous and beautiful, as you know, the set. But the thing that just bowled me over was seeing 124 adults who were as short as I was. And some of them were shorter than I was. And I could not believe that because I had always been the shortest person in the class. So what I used to do, go ahead.
I was say, how old were you at this time?
I had just turned 7. My birthday's in October, and the Munchkin scene was filmed during November of 1938. So my little delight on the set was to sidle up to one of the midgets, and they did call themselves midgets. The term little people came along much later, and they never picked it up. When I was with them at Oz festivals and stuff, they called each other, they referred to themselves as the midgets. So that's the word I'm going to use, even though for some people it might not be politically correct today. But I would sidle up to one of the midgets and level my head against theirs and see, aha, see, I'm taller than that person is, and that person's an adult. That to me was just delightful. It was never written for publication. I wrote those stories for my kids. Right after I retired from Channel 2, I decided I had spent all those years writing other people's stories, and I wanted to write my own for them so that they could understand. Because my mother never would talk about her upbringing, and I knew a couple of very interesting incidents, like being taken to the volcano and when she was a child, by her grandmother and being dedicated to Pele. I mean, a lot of really great stuff. She would never talk about it. So I decided that I would reveal all to my kids. So I wrote those stories for them, and I gave them to them as my present to them on my 70th birthday. That was almost 20 years ago. So I'm going to be 90 in October. So that was the story. And I printed them out, and I printed pictures from the family albums, and I gave them 3-leaf binder, a 3 whatever ring binder things, my stories, all the stories. And that was it. And they've sat there for 20 years. And over those years, every once in a while, a friend would read a story or two. But in 2019, I was named the city's treasure artist. And one of the reporters started asking me so much about how does a hard knuckle reporter become a hula teacher? I mean, she couldn't really put it together. And so I gave her my story about the hula and the who and the hula, and which was all one story. In the book, it's 2 chapters, but it was originally one story. And I gave that to her to read. And I said, this will, she was asking me so many questions about it. I said, I wrote a story about that, take this and read it. And if you have any more questions, come back and we'll talk. And she came back and she said, God, this is a great story, Betty. And I said, oh yeah, well, I wrote a whole bunch of them, a dozen or so for my kids. And she said, you did? May I read others? And I said, oh, sure. And I gave her my 3-ring binder of the stories. And she came back a week later and she said, you need to publish these. And they're great. I said, I don't have time. I'm busy. I'm really busy. So that was in January or so of 2019. Well, what happens in March of 2019, and I have all kinds of time and wondering what I'm going to do with my spare time, because I don't do well being idle. I always, and I think you too, you have to have a project. You've got this major project all over you. I can see the background of it, everything. So I thought, maybe I could publish those stories. And I realized that this guy, David Bowling, who was a publisher of a local magazine here, his magazine hadn't come out for a couple of issues. And I've always I didn't know him personally, but I'd met him a couple of times and I admired his writing. I thought he was just a brilliant writer, David Bowling. So I emailed him and I said, I noticed your magazine hasn't come out. If it's on hiatus because of the pandemic, would you like a short-term project helping me get my stories together? And he wrote back and he said, on 2 conditions. Number 1, that I like your stories. Number 2, that you do everything I tell you to do. And I said, sure, I accept the first one. And I said, we'll negotiate the second one. And so we had a good laugh over that. And we're just best friends now. He's brilliant. So he organized the stories and he told me to pump some up and, fatten some here and there and put in some more details about this and that. And he helped me arrange them in an order so that it is a book, because it wasn't a book before.
Well, not only was that a wonderful answer, but now I don't need to ask the question, how did you come to write a book?
Oh, because of the purpose of the stories for my sons, I was as candid as and open and honest as I could possibly be. Then last year, I decided that, I'm so old. These little details that I probably wouldn't have written if I were writing a book to be published, I'm so old. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I don't care. So what? And so there's a lot of stuff in there that would never have gotten in there if I had written a book for publication.
I don't want you sharing all of your stories on this interview because I want to save them for the book and to have people buy it, of course. But would you have maybe a favorite story that you would be willing to share with our audience?
Well, there are so many wonderful things about having been part of that, even though it was only 3 weeks of my life when I was 7 years old. It's a huge part of my identity, and especially my identity with other people. One of my favorite things was my mother always packed lunch for us. She was at the studio with me every single day, and we would go to lunch at the next sound stage, which was where the Flying Monkeys practiced. And to sit there as a 7-year-old and watch aerialists do touchdowns, while you're eating your cold chicken drumstick was just, it's hard for people to understand today what the world was like then, but it was the end of the Depression, 1938. And there were no Technicolor movies. There were no Disneylands. There were no Marine Lands. There was no television. It was a black and white world, basically, pretty drab. And And people didn't have the money and the flash that they live with today. Children didn't have the toys they have today. So those little treats were huge in my life.
You mentioned not being a little person because you were a standard sized child. So your life was not marked by the kind of discrimination and difficulties that a lot of the little people had. And yet I've read your book and you dealt with racial discrimination because of your Hawaiian background. You have a great deal about religion and its impact on your life. Your home burned to the ground and you suffered all this injustice at the hands of insurance agents.
Yeah.
It seems to me that you have used your life, your experience with the CIA as a reporter, to try and make a difference in the lives of a lot of other people. And I'm wondering what kind of a legacy you feel you have, because it comes across to me in the book, but I was hoping in your own words you could talk a little bit about being a whole lot more than a munchkin.
Well, it's connected with the title because my determination or my attitude toward life and overcoming what I consider obstacles in life is it's a good metaphor, the yellow brick road, because Dorothy and her friends met with all kinds of obstacles on their trip on the yellow brick road. And my life was not particularly easy because I was a brown-skinned girl who was raised as a white-skinned girl in a white world. My father was Dutch Irish from Texas. My mother was Chinese Hawaiian from Hawaii, who was transplanted to California in the 30s. It was not a time when being ethnic was considered chic or desirable. So she suffered some pain and became quite bitter about her treatment by some people who made assumptions about her. So she protected my brother and me from our ethnic identities, which turned out to be a great disservice to us. She hid her Chinese background from us entirely. I didn't even know I was part Chinese until I got my birth certificate when I was 21 years old. About being Hawaiian, she was a native speaker, but never taught us more than about 5 words in Hawaiian. She never told us about the incredibly rich background of the Hawaiian people, the Hawaiian nation, their skills at navigation, their attitude toward living in nature and balancing everything, the respect they had for the world they lived in, which Western world is just coming to call sustained living. We're just coming to grips with that now, to realize that. The Hawaiians have had that for thousands of years. So there was a lot of wisdom. She shielded us from that and raised us as though we were Dutch Irish. Speak good English, get good grades in school, succeed in whatever you do. So there was a lot of determination. There were some valuable lessons she taught us, but I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what it meant to be Hawaiian, and I didn't even know I was part Chinese. So when I got to college, it was the first time I was on my own. And people would ask me where I was from. And I'd say, I was from this little town in Southern California, Hammett. Oh, yeah. Well, where are you really from? Looking for my ethnic background, which I was not prepared to talk about because I didn't know anything about it. There were blondes and blue-eyed students at Stanford, where I went to college, who were from Punahou, who could hula, speak pidgin, knew all about the islands, knew everything that I, as a Hawaiian, should have known, but didn't. So I really felt out of place for a very long time. That continued throughout college. And when I went to Washington, worked for the CIA right after college, people there were even more curious than people at Stanford had been about where I was from, where I was really from. And I couldn't handle it. I was really very ill at ease talking about what I was or who I was. So we moved out to Berkeley in the mid 50s. I was in my 20s. And I thought, there are a lot of Hawaiians in this area. I'm going to find them, and I'm going to find what it means to be Hawaiian. And I thought, I love to dance. So I'll do that through the hula. So I found this wonderful hula teacher, and she became my quote Hawaiian mom, even though my own mother has, had all the Hawaiian background that anybody would ever want, but she never told me about it. She never shared it with me until later. So through the hula, I learned what it was to be Hawaiian. And from her name was Ida Wong Gonzalez, and she was the premier hula teacher and hula performer in the Bay Area in the 50s and the 60s and on into the 70s. So I danced and became Hawaiian, and I loved to dance. And then I got a wonderful job at Channel 2 and became a reporter, news reporter, and I loved that. And I was so busy, then I had kids, too busy with family and my career, that hula just ebbed away from my life. I didn't have time to do it well. So I emceed Ida's shows, but I didn't dance for 30 years until
But you're back dancing now.
after I retired and I decompressed from the busyness of news. I decided I would treat myself to the hula again, and I got back into the hula, and now it's the core of my life. I have a wonderful group of ladies whom I teach the hula. We do shows all over the valley. My life is full of Hawaiian music and Hawaiian friends, and I've studied a little bit of the language. I'm still not fluent. My mother also returned to her Hawaiian background. About 10 years after I started dancing, she finally agreed to come and see a show up here. She was still in Southern California. I'm in Northern California. She came up to see me dance, hadn't seen me dance yet. She walks into this room of 500 people. She knew most of them from, and she's speaking Hawaiian. The next thing I know, she's got a muumuu on and she's on a plane to Hawaii. She returned to her roots. My father had died many years earlier. She returned to her roots, met a guy she had gone to grammar school with. He had just lost his wife, full-blooded Hawaiian. They got married and lived like a Hawaiian couple again. So she lived in a Hawaiian community the last 20 years of her life.
It was the hula, and you're leading a dance company or instructing, as I understand, that led to this award you received as an artist.
Yes. Every year for about 40 something years, Sonoma has named a treasure artist. And it's always been someone in the fine arts, of a painter, a sculptor. I don't know that I think there have been some writers too, but there's never been anybody who's taught the hula. And I was just kind of blown away by it, because this is a small town, so the town of Sonoma, California. I think the official population is around 9,000. There are 20,000 people who live in the valley, but it's a small town, and a wonderful, attitude toward things. They just welcome the hula. We do a 1-hour show in the Central Plaza every year as our gift of aloha to this community, because it's been so welcoming. We dance at all the residential homes. We dance for birthday parties. We've danced at funerals. We dance at the drop of a hat. At Christmas time, we'd go hula caroling. We dance to I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. We have a beautiful hula to that Ida choreographed. We dance to Winter Wonderland, and then we go from one residential place to another during their long lunch hour. We can hit about 5 places a day the week before Christmas, and we pop in and dance our 2 hula carols, and then we mele kalikimaka, and we leave, and it's fun.
A memorable part of your book for me was about the loss of your home and the subsequent pursuit you had of justice with insurance companies. You took up that banner to ensure that future homeowners who suffered similar losses would not have to experience what you and so many other people in your area at the time did.
It's a complicated story, Jane, and so I may go on and on. I have always been interested in politics. The thing that appealed to me as a reporter, And the reason I joined the League of Women Voters and was very active in that organization is that I am fascinated by the use and abuse of power. That's the key to a whole lot of relationships and good stories. So what happened after the fire was that the insurance company we had was responsible for about 1/3 of the 3,000 homes that had burned. They looked at 1,000 destroyed homes and saw a huge liability because in those days, competing insurance companies sold what they called guaranteed replacement cost insurance, which meant that if you had an old home that had hardwood floors, pegged floors, masonry fireplaces, not inserts, lath and plaster walls, not wallboard, in order to replace that, the insurance company had to pay you the money it would cost to rebuild that house the way it was in the first place, not according to the standards that existed in 1990s. So if your home was 50 years old, it was, after it burned to the ground, it was worth a lot more than you could have sold it for the day before the fire. That was what happened to us and to a lot of people, because the fire was in the open hills where a lot of people in beautiful homes. So the insurance companies, with very few exceptions, started playing terrible games to delay the recovery of insurance to their clients. So the games consisted of changing adjusters every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks so that the homeowners would have to start over again every month with some new adjuster, and you couldn't build your house. After about 5 or 6 months, we realized that our insurance company probably wanted to take 4 or 5 years before we would have our house rebuilt. And we couldn't do that. We weren't willing to spend our time, 5 years of our lives, rebuilding our house. We wanted to get on with our lives because we had interesting lives. Both my husband and I worked at Channel 2. We had wonderful careers. That's what we wanted to do. We didn't want to spend all of our time with bricks and mortar. So we sold our lot and we moved. And I did the story for the station 2 years after the fire. I looked at the results. There were 35 homes under construction out of 3,000 2 years later. And everybody was struggling with the insurance stuff. And I was close to retirement. I mean, I was retired at that point. I was retired. And I thought, I'm going to dig into this. So I called up the insurance commissioner for the state and talked to them. And they said, it would be good to hear from the people. So I decided to do some organizing. So I organized a public hearing. And you're correct. My connection with Channel 2 did help a lot because I was able to get coverage through in not just my own station, but a lot of other stations and newspapers and everything on what the insurance companies were doing to the homeowners. So I lined up some speakers to testify about what was happening to them. And it wasn't a pretty picture, especially with older people. Several insurance companies were just waiting for them to die and just sort of, dickering around with them and delaying things. And here we are 2 years later, there are no results. And so they got the picture. The lawmakers, the legislators who came to the hearing all understood what was going on. So they introduced some reform legislation. And I was really privileged to be part of that process. Now, the bill that was the result of my public hearing got vetoed by the governor of the state. It passed. Democrats voted for it. Republicans voted against it. The Republican governor vetoed it. And one of the insurance lobbyists told me that's what was going to happen. He actually said, you've gotten your bill through the legislature. Congratulations, but you're not going to have it signed into law because we own the governor. That's a tough lesson in the use and abuse of power. But it was true. But the ball was thrown by our efforts, and eventually reform legislation has happened. So I won't take credit for all of that, but I will take credit for sort of making the first pitch out there. Thank you.
I did also want to ask before we close, both Steve Cox and Bob Baum contributed to your book.
Yes.
Can you tell us how you came to know them and involve them in the Munchkin Diary?
I met Steve Cox on the phone. I think it was in the 80s or the 90s. He had just graduated from college and wanted to write a book about the Munchkins and was looking for anybody who'd ever been a Munchkin. So there was a little article in the San Francisco Chronicle, which I happened to see. This guy, author, looking for anybody who'd been involved with the movies, especially he'd been a Munchkin. So I said, "What? What's a Munchkin?" I called him up. And I said I was a Munchkin. And he asked me about 1,001 questions because I think he expected a lot of people who claimed to be Munchkins who hadn't been. So when I told him my mother was still alive and she'd been at the set with me, he called her and checked on my story with what she said. And when he called me back and he said, "Well, your mom says the same thing about your experiences that you did." So he accepted the fact that I was telling the truth. The problem was there were no pictures, that my mother never took a picture of me during those 3 weeks on the set. In the 30s, people didn't, I mean, she took a couple pictures of my brother and me in Hollywood, but never at a show, never in any of the movies we were in. And we were in, several movies as children, mostly Hawaiian movies about the South Seas, but not one picture, not any visual proof that I had been on that set. So he just took my word for it and included me in his book. He found 30 of the Munchkins, but he and I became friends out of that, and we're still in touch, and he's written so many books since then. He's just a wonderful person. So he was very gracious and wrote that the story of that for my book. Robert Baum, I met at one of the Oz conventions, when you've been to a million of them, right? I just went to one. After I retired from Channel 2, I had the time to do that. And I thought, well, I'm going to do this. So my husband and I went to the Oz convention in Chesterton, Indiana. And I guess it's one of the largest conventions in the country for a very small town, about the size of Sonoma. I heard there were 95,000 Oz fans there that week. The merchants in Chesterton loved the week of the Oz Festival better than they loved Christmas because business was so good. Well, I had met some of the midgets before at a television station, but I hadn't spent any time with them. But spending those 3 or 4 day long weekend with them was just amazing. They just wonderful, kind, happy people, nice, just nice. But they worked us all pretty hard. And to me, it was 3 weeks out of my childhood. It was a wonderful dreamlike experience, but it was still part of my childhood. For the midgets, it was more of their life identity. I mean, I had grown up. I was no longer the size of a munchkin. I wasn't under 4.5 feet tall. Not much taller than that, but I wouldn't make the cut today if I had to audition for the Munchkin part. But some of the midgets, they had their they had remade their costumes, and they come to these conventions, dressed up like the soldier and the Munchkin and all the mayor and all of that. It was a life for them. It was not the same thing for me, but I still had to sit there and sign autographs, one after another, thousands of them. That's what they had us do from the time we were up in the morning until late at night. I mean, all day long, that's all we did was sign autographs. And I had writer's cramps up to my ear. I mean,
what was Bob doing? You started the story telling us how you met Bob Baum at this.
Well, he was there too as a celebrity. I guess he was also signing autographs. He had to be. But if you're signing autographs, you don't have time to talk to anybody else who may be signing autographs too. So, but we met, and then we started exchanging Christmas cards just because he and Claire are just nice. And so we've had a Christmas card exchange ever since, well, 20 years or something like that, 30 years, I guess, long time. Although we haven't met personally, but when I was going to publish the book, I thought, oh, I'd love him to say something. I asked him to do that. He graciously wrote this wonderful story about where the word Oz came from in his great grandfather's story about how he came up with Oz as the answer to the question of what's the name of this land that where all these stories are taking place, Mr. Baum. I love that story. That's a great introduction, isn't it?
It was both the introduction and the preface. I just thought it was terrific. And both those men are well known within the Oz community. So I was particularly pleased that they are who you chose to have introduce your book.
I was thrilled. And I said, I mean, they were just so nice and gracious to do that. And I do appreciate it. Even though, one person, I talk about the book to a lot of book clubs. And so the emphasis is my personal yellow brick road. And it's the story of my journey through life. I wrote it for my kids to tell them my experiences. I didn't write it for publication, but the advice I got from a professional was that the Munchkin Diary is a good title because it's the most attractive. But somebody asked, well, why did you call it the Munchkin Diary? And the answer is so I could talk about my personal yellow brick road, my trip of life. That's really what it is.
Well, it is a wonderful book and one that I certainly recommend.
You can get the book through Amazon. It's available at some local bookstores here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I am also available for communication at my Hula website, which is Hulamai, that's Hulamai, hulamai.org. And also a website we're still working on for the Munchkin. I am the Munchkin at themunchkindiary.org. So the name of the book, .org, themunchkindiary.org. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time today and hope that we will be hearing more from you in the future.
Oh, it's really nice to meet you, Jane. I've heard so much about your organization and, I admire what you're doing and that keeps you very busy. I know that, because I still get a couple of fan mails asking for my autograph on things. I got a letter a week or so ago from, it was the Ukraine. Oh no, it was from Hungary. A letter from Hungary. I mean, that film is so beloved by so many people all over the world. Frank Baum's legacy is going to live forever and ever. Well,
and you are a part of it.
I feel very, very blessed to be part of it. I do. Yeah. Thank you. Did you meet Craig?
Yeah, we sort of did.
Signed on.
Hi, Jane.
I have one picture from with Judy Garland, it's the only picture. Steve Cox found it. It's in the book.
Yeah, I think I saw it.
Steve Cox found it when he was visiting Meinhard Robbie one year, and it was just a few years ago. He didn't have it for his own book. I think it was probably, I would want to say, between 5 and 10 years ago. And he was looking through Meinhard Robbie's personal scrapbook, and he looked at that picture and he said, I think that's Betty Ann. Can I have a copy of that picture? I'm going to send it and see if that is her. And so he sent it to me and I just took one look at it. I said, yes, of course. He said, now I'm going to send you something. I want you to look at it very carefully and make sure, blah, blah. I said, yeah, it's me. I was so happy to get it. I don't remember anybody's name except Valerie Shepard. I do remember her.
Huh, I don't remember that name. Was she one of the little girls?
She was one of the little girls. She took dancing lessons at the same studio, the Bud Murray studio in Hollywood, where we took. And her mother was like stage mom on steroids. That my mother used to talk about poor little Valerie, those were the days of Shirley Temple.
Uh-huh.
Valerie's hair was dyed, was bleached, and she had all these little. I mean, her hair was dark. I mean, mine is now dyed because my hair is gray, but her hair was the color of mine, and her mother bleached it. And Valerie was a little tiny little girl, and who took. Uh, I didn't call it ballet in those days. I called it toe shoes. So Valerie danced in toe shoes. And when on the set, I do remember this, that whenever a producer looking like person came along, Mrs. Shepherd would push Valerie out there and say, dance, dance, Valerie, and dance. Valerie would go through this little, we all had to go to school on the set too. And I remember the teacher, and and later on at Stanford, that teacher's daughter was one of my roommates. And she and I became really good friends. And Mrs. Carter's name was the teacher's name. And Diana always insisted that her mother was Judy Garland's teacher. But I said, no, she was our teacher.
Thank you, Betty Ann. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. It has been for me too.